A man who spent 9 years building an honest life had it ripped away in 9 minutes. Warning, no fair hearing, just a cardboard box, a walk of shame through a silent warehouse, and a little girl at home waiting for her dad, who now had nothing to offer her but the truth. But the real thief? He was still inside, still smiling, still collecting a paycheck. This is the story of Caleb Whitaker and the Tuesday that nearly broke him. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This story is just beginning, and trust me, you will not want to miss a single moment of what comes next. And while you're at it, drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go back to Redwood Falls. The alarm went off at 5:15, same as always. Caleb Whitaker didn't slam it or groan. Yet he just reached over, pressed the button, and lay there for a moment, in the dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. The apartment wasn't much 2 bedrooms, drafty windows in winter, a kitchen faucet that dripped unless you turned it exactly right. But it was theirs. He'd paid for every square inch of it himself, and there was something about that fact that made even the water stain feel okay. He got up, padded down the hall in socked feet, and pushed open the door to Maisie's room. She was asleep on her stomach, one arm hanging off the mattress, her dark hair fanned out across the pillow. She was 8 years old, and she slept like the world owed her nothing, which Caleb figured was exactly how a kid was supposed to sleep. He stood in the doorway for a few seconds longer than he needed to. He did that most mornings, just stood there, quietly accounting for her. Like a man checking to make sure something precious hadn't been moved in the night. Then he went to make breakfast. Caleb Whitaker had worked at Northstar Distribution for 9 years. He'd started at 23, fresh out of a stretch of bad luck, a community college semester. He couldn't finish because of money, a brief stint at a fast food place that went nowhere, failed attempt at getting hired by the county road crew. Northstar wasn't glamorous. It was a logistics warehouse on the industrial east side of Redwood Falls, Minnesota, a flat, practical building surrounded by loading docks, chain link fencing, and the kind of parking lot that collected puddles in every corner. The work was physical. The hours were early. The pay started at just above minimum wage. But they hired him, and Caleb Whitaker was not the kind of man who wasted a chance. By year 2, he was one of the fastest pickers on the floor. By year 4, the shift supervisors were asking him to train new hires because he explained things without making people feel stupid. By year 7, he had his own team, 12 people, rotating shifts, responsible for coordinating incoming and outgoing freight on the east loading bay. Every forklift operator by name. He knew which dock doors stuck in cold weather. He knew which pallets to double-check and which vendors always shorted the count by 2 or 3 units and then argued about it later. He was, in the language of warehouses, reliable, not flashy, political, not the kind of employee who angled for visibility or dropped comments into management meetings designed to make himself look smart. He just did the work day after day, and he did it right. 3 years back, Maisie's mother had left not dramatically, with a fight, just quietly, and with a lot of reasons that all added up to the same thing. She didn't want this life. She'd signed the custody papers without a lawyer, packed a bag, and moved to Portland. Called Maisie on birthdays and sometimes on random Tuesday evenings when the guilt caught up with her. And then sometimes months went by and she didn't call at all. Caleb never said a word against her to Maisie. He figured Maisie would make her own judgments eventually, and it wasn't his job to influence the verdict. What he could do was be there. Every morning, every school pickup, every parent-teacher conference and sick day and nightmare at 2 in the morning and proud moment at the school science fair, where Maisie's baking soda volcano had erupted impressively enough to earn second place. Ribbon that was still pinned to her corkboard. He did all of it alone, and he never once treated it like a burden worth mentioning. The morning of that particular Tuesday in October felt like every other Tuesday. Caleb made scrambled eggs and toast, poured 2 glasses of orange juice, and called down the hall twice before Maisie materialized in the kitchen. Hair still half tangled, school shoes untied and dragging. "You need to set your own alarm," he told her, the same thing he said every morning. "My alarm is you," she said, the same thing she said every time. She climbed onto the bar stool at the kitchen counter and started eating without ceremony, one elbow on the counter, her eyes still mostly closed. Caleb stood across from her, eating his own eggs, leaning against the counter, the way he always did, because there was something about watching her wake up slowly, piece by piece, that he found quietly satisfying. "Spelling test today," she said, around a mouthful of toast. "I think so. You think so? Or you know so?" She looked at him through narrowed 8-year-old eyes. "Necessary has 1 C and 2 S's. That's the one people always mess up. That's why I'm telling you." She picked up her juice. "I've got it." He believed her. Maisie was stubborn in the way that quiet kids sometimes are, not loud about her confidence, but firm. She'd decided she wasn't going to miss that word, so she wouldn't miss it. He respected that about her, more than he knew how to say. He dropped her at school at 7:40, watched her through the front doors without looking back. She'd stopped doing that. Somewhere around second grade, the backwards glance, and he'd noticed the exact morning it stopped, then drove across town to Northstar. Clocked in at 8:03. The shipment had arrived the previous Thursday. It was a high-value electronics transfer, laptops, tablets, and peripheral equipment bound for a corporate account in Chicago. The total value was somewhere in the neighborhood of $508,000, which made it one of the larger single shipments Northstar's Redwood Falls facility had processed in the past year. Caleb's team had received it, logged it, and stored it in the secure inventory area, with every protocol followed correctly. He'd signed the final intake paperwork himself, 4 pages of inventory confirmation, item-by-item count verification, and chain of custody documentation, because that was his job, and he did his job. The shipment was scheduled for outbound transfer on Friday morning. Friday morning it wasn't there. Not a missing box. A short count. The entire shipment, every pallet, every carton was gone from the secure bay. What followed was the kind of institutional panic that large companies perform in very recognizable ways. Conference calls multiplied. Emails with capital letters appeared. People who hadn't spoken to each other in months found themselves in the same room, talking over each other. The security team was called. Operations was called. Someone called corporate, and then operations director Graham Pike, who was 44 years old and had been with Northstar for 11 years and wore the kind of dress shirts that were expensive enough to have a subtle pattern, walked into the investigation meeting with Caleb's signed paperwork in his hand. "The last person to handle this shipment," Graham said, laying the documents on the table, was Caleb Whitaker. Caleb was pulled into a conference room he'd never been in before, the one on the administrative floor. No, with the long table and the framed photograph of the Redwood Falls skyline on the wall, which struck him as an odd thing to photograph because Redwood Falls wasn't really a skyline kind of town. There were 2 HR representatives, a compliance officer whose name he didn't catch, and Graham Pike sitting at the far end of the table like he was presiding over something. Caleb sat down. He was not nervous. Exactly. He was alert in the way that a person gets when something is wrong, but they don't yet know what shape the wrong is going to take. He looked around the table calmly, set his hands flat on the surface, and waited. Caleb, the lead HR representative, a woman named Donna, whom he'd exchanged exactly 4 conversations with in 9 years, began carefully. "We're looking into the disappearance of the Thursday electronic shipment. Your signature appears on all the final intake documentation." "Does," Caleb said. "I processed that shipment. My team logged it in. I signed off. Everything was accounted for. The shipment is no longer in inventory," Donna said. "I understand that. I heard this morning. I don't know what happened to it." Graham leaned forward slightly. Not much, just enough to communicate that he was steering something. "Caleb, your signature is the last record we have of anyone officially touching that freight. The chain of custody ends with you. Caleb looked at him. Because I was the last one to log it in. That's how intake works. I'm not responsible for what happens to it after it's secured. Graham said, setting a printed page on the table and sliding it toward him. Our access records show your badge was used to enter the secure bay twice on Thursday evening. After your shift. Caleb looked at the page. He looked at it for a long moment. That's not possible, he said. I left at 4:30. I had to pick up my daughter from her after-school program. The records show badge access at 6:52 and again at 8:17 p.m. The records are wrong. Or someone used my badge. I wasn't here. Graham sat back. He didn't say anything. He just let the silence sit there. And Caleb understood, with a cold and very specific clarity, the silence was deliberate. That it was designed to feel like doubt. Donna asked if anyone could corroborate his whereabouts. He gave them the name of the after-school program, the time he'd picked Maisie up, the dinner they'd had at home. He said his neighbor, Mrs. Parrish, had knocked on his door around 7 to return a baking dish she'd borrowed, and they'd spoken in the hallway for 10 minutes. He offered all of it, steadily and without rushing, because he had nothing to hide, and he'd never been in a situation where having nothing to hide wasn't enough. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. At the end of it, Donna told him that pending investigation, he was being placed on suspension. Graham collected the papers from the table without making eye contact. The suspension lasted 4 days. During those 4 days, Caleb called Northstar's HR line 3 times and was told someone would get back to him. He contacted a legal aid office and was told he could schedule a consultation for the following week. He cleaned the apartment. He took Maisie to the park and pushed her on the swings and listened to her describe in extensive detail a disagreement she'd had with her friend Petra about whether a movie they'd seen was scary or just surprising. He cooked dinner every evening. He didn't tell Maisie what was happening. On the 4th evening, his phone rang. It was Donna. Caleb, she said, and her voice was carefully neutral in a way that told him everything before she said another word. I'm calling to let you know that Northstar has completed its internal review. Based on the available evidence, the documentation, the access records, and the value of the missing inventory moving with termination, effective immediately. He was quiet. I didn't take anything, he said. I understand this is difficult, Donna said. It was not the same as responding to what he'd just told her. Your final paycheck and separation documents will be mailed to the address on file. Need to return your badge and any company property. We can arrange a time for you to collect your personal belongings from the facility. I've worked there for 9 years, Caleb said. I know. A pause. I'm sorry, Caleb. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. The faucet dripped. Outside, a car went past slowly. Down the hall, he could hear the soft sound of Maisie's TV she was allowed 1 hour before bed, always the same natured documentary channel she'd been obsessed with since she was 6. Thought about the signed paperwork. He thought about Graham Pike sliding that page across the conference table. He thought about 9 years of arriving early and staying late and training new people and fixing problems quietly before they became someone else's headache. Pressed his palms flat against the table and breathed. He went back to the warehouse the following morning to collect his things. He schemed. Donna had arranged it for 8 a.m. before most of the floor staff arrived. Warehouses run early, and by 8, there were already people clocking in, moving through the building, starting their shifts. Word had gotten around in logistics facilities, it always did, and Caleb could feel the awareness in the building the moment he walked through the side entrance. Carried a flat cardboard box that had previously contained copy paper. His workspace wasn't large, a small supervisory desk tucked into the corner of the East Bay, open to the warehouse's floor, visible to everyone. Packed methodically. A coffee mug. A small framed photograph of Maisie at the science fair holding her second-place ribbon with both hands and grinning the way she did when she was trying not to look too pleased with herself. A worn notebook he used to track daily logistics. A phone charger. Pair of work gloves. While he packed, the warehouse floor around him wasn't loud. People worked. Forklifts moved. Equipment beeped. But in the section of the floor nearest to him, there was a kind of dampened quality to the noise. The way sound behaves when people are aware of something, and choosing not to look directly at it. Marcus, one of the forklift operators Caleb had worked alongside for 6 years, walked past and stopped. "Hey," Marcus said quietly. "Hey," Caleb said. Marcus looked at the cardboard box. He looked like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the right shape for it. He stopped, started again. "I don't think you did it." "I know, for what it's worth." "It is worth something," Caleb said. "Thank you, Marcus." Marcus moved on. Nobody else stopped. Caleb picked up the box, took one last look at the east bay, the dock doors, the shelving, units, the worn concrete floor he'd walked across 10,000 times, and then he walked out through the side entrance. Put the box in his trunk. He sat in the driver's seat for a minute, with both hands on the wheel, not going anywhere. Then he drove home. That evening, Maisie was already at the kitchen table, doing homework when he came in. She was working on a math worksheet, erasing something with more force than was strictly necessary, and she looked up when the door opened. She saw his face. Kids who grow up mostly with one parent develop a particular kind of attentiveness to that parent's expression. They become fluent in the face in a way that other children aren't. Maisie had been reading Caleb's face since she was 3 years old, and she was very good at it. She put down her pencil. "Dad," she said, "what happened?" He sat down across from her at the table. He looked at her, this serious, perceptive, scruffy-haired kid who'd eaten scrambled eggs with him that morning, and announced with total confidence that she had her spelling word sorted, and he tried to figure out how to do this right. "I lost my job today," he said. Her eyes went wide. "At Northstar?" "Yeah," she was quiet for a moment, processing. "Why?" He thought about lying. He thought about softening it. Thought he'd intervened. He thought about the dozen ways a parent reflexively reaches for comfort language when the truth is harder than the words available for it. "Something went missing at the warehouse," he said. "Something expensive. And they decided I was responsible for it." "Were you?" The question was direct, the way Maisie asked most things, not accusatory, just honest. He looked into her eyes. "No," he said. "I wasn't." She studied him for a long moment with those eyes that were too old for her face, the way they sometimes got. Then she nodded once, like she was filing something away. "So what happens now?" "I'm going to figure that out," he said. "I'm going to find work. It might be a little tight for a while." "We're going to be okay. Are you sure?" The question landed quietly between them. Caleb held her gaze and didn't look away. "Yeah," he said. "I'm sure." She picked up her pencil. She looked back at her worksheet. She erased the thing she'd been fighting with and wrote the answer in the clean space it left behind. "Okay," she said. And that was how Maisie was. She didn't fall apart. She didn't make it bigger than it was, or smaller. She just listened, asked her questions, got her answers, and went back to work. Caleb didn't know if that was a function of her nature or something he'd accidentally taught her. But either way, he was grateful for it. Later, he sat on the edge of her bed when he tucked her in. He'd intervened. The room was dim, just the small nightlight in the corner, and she lay on her back, looking at the ceiling the way she did when she was thinking about something too big to say out loud. "Dad," she said quietly. "Yeah. Did you do something wrong?" He thought she'd already asked this in a different way. But she was asking again, because 8-year-olds need things confirmed more than once. And he knew that. He said simply, "I didn't." She looked at him in the low light of her room, her dark eyes steady and serious. "What matters?" she said. "A beat, right?" He'd been trying to say exactly that to her, and somehow she'd gotten there ahead of him. He said, "That's what matters." He sat there a little longer than he needed to. She was asleep before he stood up, her breath evening out, into the slow, uncomplicated rhythm of a child who has decided the night is safe. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her, the same way he'd done that morning, accounting for her. He went to the kitchen, sat at the table with a cup of coffee that went cold before he finished it, and began, very quietly, to figure out what came next. He had $34 in his checking account, 9 years of honest work attached to a termination for theft, and a daughter and who still believed him without needing to. He didn't know yet that 2 miles across town, in a building made of glass and steel, that most people in Redwood Falls only ever looked at from the outside, a young woman named Sabrina Lockwood was sitting in front of a security monitor with her coffee going equally cold, watching a recording that was going to change everything. Sabrina Lockwood did not sleep well on the best of nights. This was something her assistant knew, her housekeeper knew, and the night security staff at the Northstar corporate office knew that he'd intervened, because there were weeks when her car would pull into the underground garage at 11 p.m. and not leave again until 6 the following morning, and the lights in her corner office on the 14th floor would stay on the entire time. People who worked for her had learned not to comment on it. It was simply a fact of working for Sabrina. She kept hours that suggested either extraordinary dedication or a complicated relationship with being alone, and nobody was paid enough to ask which one it was. She was 30 years old. She had inherited Northstar Distribution at 26 when her father died of a heart attack on a golf course in Scottsdale, with no warning and no succession plan beyond a will that left the company to her because she was the only person he trusted to not immediately sell it. Harrison Lockwood had built Northstar from a regional trucking operation into a nationwide logistics company over 30 years, and he had done it with the particular stubbornness of a man who never explained himself and expected the people around him to keep up. Sabrina had grown up watching him run it. She understood the company the way you understand a language you grew up speaking, not because you studied it, but because it was simply in the air around you for as long as you could remember. What she hadn't anticipated when she stepped into the role was how many people would be watching for her to fail. Were board members who'd been loyal to her father and treated her with the specific politeness reserved for people you're tolerating until something changes. There were executives who smiled in meetings and then sent emails to each other afterward that she was sometimes forwarded by accident. There were industry contacts who shook her hand at conferences and asked her, very kindly, how she was managing, the word carrying a particular weight that suggested they didn't quite believe she was. She had managed. She had managed very deliberately and with the kind of controlled focus that left little room for anything else. She was good at the work. She was less good at the parts of the job that required her to trust people she hadn't yet proven she could trust, and the parts that required her to let go of things once they were delegated. She knew this about herself. She'd been told it often enough, in formal reviews and in more personal moments that had not ended well, that she'd stopped being surprised by the observation. What she hadn't been told, because there was no one close enough to tell her, was that her instinct for people, her gut sense of when something was wrong, was one of the sharpest tools she had. And on the night that Caleb Whitaker was sitting at a kitchen table in a 2-bedroom apartment, watching his coffee go cold, that instinct was keeping her awake. She'd been in Chicago for a two-day vendor conference when the call came about the missing shipment. She'd flown back that evening, arrived at the office at 9 p.m., and found Graham Pike's preliminary incident report waiting on Ted's desk with a summary that ran to 3 pages and concluded with what struck her as suspicious efficiency. The evidence pointed clearly to Caleb Whitaker. She'd read the report twice. Then she'd sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. There was nothing technically wrong with the report. Access records, the paperwork, the chain of custody, it was all laid out logically, everything pointing in one direction. Graham had attached a recommendation for immediate termination, and HR had already begun the process by the time she landed. She hadn't stopped it. That was the thing she came back to. Later, she hadn't stopped it when she should have. She'd been tired from the conference, and there were 40 other things on her desk. And Graham had been with the company for 11 years, and she'd never had significant reason to question his judgment. So she'd signed off, provisionally, with a note that she wanted to review the final investigation report before anything became permanent, but she'd signed off. Then she'd gone home, tried to sleep, and found that her brain would not cooperate. She lay in the dark of her apartment, which was large and quiet, and had a view of the river that cost more per month than most people's annual salaries, and which she had furnished with expensive restraint and almost never enjoyed, and she kept thinking about a detail that shouldn't have mattered. 9 years. She'd looked at Caleb Whitaker's employee file before she left the office. Years, not one disciplinary note, not one HR complaint. One write-up for tardiness or performance or attitude. He'd received 3 merit reviews that described him in language that was specific rather than generic supervisors, writing things like consistently thinks 2 steps ahead, and the team performs better when Caleb's on shift, which told her the reviews were real, because people writing filler performance reviews use words like dedicated and hardworking, without ever saying anything specific. She was thinking about what kind of man builds 9 years of that kind of record, and then, for no reason, steals a $500,000 shipment using his own paperwork and his own badge. She was thinking about how that didn't make sense. And she was thinking about Graham Pike, who had delivered the report with an efficiency that, in retrospect, felt slightly too practiced. She got up at 2 in the morning. She drove to the office. The night security guard at the front desk, a retired cop named Earl, who had worked the building for 8 years, treated Sabrina with the same uncomplicated respect he gave everyone. Looked up when she came through the lobby and said, "Evening, Ms. Lockwood," without any visible surprise, because he'd seen this before. "Evening, Earl," she said. "Is the server room accessible?" "Always is for you." She went upstairs to her office, made herself a cup of the coffee that lived in the machine on her credenza. It was a decent machine. Yes, he'd intervened. The few personal indulgences she'd allowed herself when she moved into the office and pulled up the warehouse security system on her desktop. Northstar's Redwood Falls facility had 19 cameras covering the warehouse floor, docks, parking areas, and restricted access zones. The footage was stored for 30 days on a cloud-based server that Sabrina had upgraded 2 years ago when the old system kept losing data. She knew the system well because she had personally pushed for the upgrade over the objections of 2 executives who thought it was unnecessary spending. She pulled up Thursday evening, 5 p.m. onward, and started watching. The footage wasn't dramatic. It was the ordinary business of a warehouse running through end-of-day operations, forklifts returning to their charging stations, floor staff clocking out in groups, dock doors closing one by one. Intervened, the lights in various sections of the building switched to the lower overnight setting. She watched Caleb Whitaker's section of the East Bay. She saw him at his supervisory desk, at 4:20 entering something in his notebook. She watched him pack up his bag at 4:27. At 4:31, she watched him walk out through the side employee entrance. He did not come back. She kept watching. At 5:45, the warehouse was mostly quiet. A skeleton crew of overnight staff moved through the building. The secure inventory bay, where the electronic shipment was stored, sat undisturbed on camera 9. 6:43, camera 9 showed a figure entering the secure bay. It was not Caleb Whitaker. Sabrina leaned forward. The figure was wearing a Northstar jacket, the generic Navy ones that management kept a supply of for site visits and vendor tours. The hood was up, but the jacket was unzipped, and as the figure moved into the camera's clearer sightline near the shelving units, Sabrina could see the dress shirt underneath. A dress shirt with a subtle pattern. She recognized it because she had been in a meeting with the man wearing it that very afternoon. She sat very still. She rewound the footage and watched it again. Then she pulled up camera 12, which covered the east side loading dock from a different angle. She found the same timestamp. And on camera 12, the hood-up figure became considerably more identifiable because camera 12 had been installed at a lower angle and caught the face more directly when the figure turned to supervise the workers loading boxes onto the truck. It was Graham Pike. He was not alone. There were 2 other men with him. She didn't recognize them, which meant they weren't Northstar employees, which told her they were outside help he'd arranged in advance. They worked quickly and with the kind of systematic efficiency that comes from having done a thing before. Within 40 minutes, every carton from the electronic shipment had been moved from the secure bay to an unmarked truck backed up to the loading dock. Graham left the dock area at 8:09 p.m. At 8:14, the access log recorded Caleb Whitaker's badge entering the secure bay. Except Caleb wasn't there. The camera footage showed the bay empty at 8:14, the overhead light triggering automatically from a badge reader that was registering an entry that wasn't physically happening. Sabrina sat back slowly. Someone had used Caleb's credentials remotely, either cloned his badge or accessed the system directly to generate an access record without an actual physical entry. It was a technical manipulation, and not a simple one, which told her Graham had either done this before or had help from someone who knew how. She pressed her palms against the desk. Her coffee was cold. She didn't move for several minutes, and what she was experiencing wasn't quite anger. It was something colder and more precise than anger. A particular sensation of understanding that a significant mistake had been made, and that she had been part of it. She had signed off. She had been tired and busy, and she had trusted a summary, because the man who wrote it had 11 years of credibility behind him, and an innocent man with a daughter at home had paid for that. She pulled up Graham's Northstar system access logs next. It took her 40 minutes to find what she was looking for, because he'd been careful. He'd deleted records, cleared cache, and in some places overwritten log entries entirely. Deletion leaves traces if you know where to look, and Sabrina had spent enough time in the weeds of Northstar's operational systems, more time than most CEOs would consider worth it, that she knew where to look. The inventory manipulation was worse than she'd expected. Graham had accessed the company's freight management system 3 separate times after Caleb's termination process began, and each time he'd made small alterations to the record-adjusting timestamps, inserting Caleb's employee ID into access logs at precise moments, and in one case changing a notation in the inventory system that would have, if anyone looked closely, indicated a discrepancy in the record's internal consistency. He hadn't been clumsy about it. He'd been methodical. Kind of methodical that suggested this wasn't the first time. Sabrina opened a new window and pulled up 18 months of inventory exception reports. By 4 in the morning, she had found 3 previous incidents smaller in scale, less visible, kinds of inventory discrepancies that get written off as clerical error or vendor miscount because they're not large enough individually to trigger a serious investigation. Yet he'd intervened. But when she mapped them against Graham's schedule and movement logs and cross-referenced with the vendor accounts involved, the pattern was clear. Graham Pike had been stealing from Northstar for at least a year and a half. Caleb Whitaker had been the exit plan, the designated explanation. The man whose 9 years of honest work had been carefully selected as the perfect cover, because an employee who had never caused problems was also an employee nobody would expect ought to cause, which made the accusation land harder and the dismissal happen faster. Sabrina stood up from her desk and walked to the window. It was 4:15 in the morning. The city outside was quiet in the specific way that cities get in the gap between late night and early morning, when the people who stay up late have gone home and the people who get up early haven't started yet. The river was dark. The lights on the bridge reflected in the water in wavering lines. She stood there for a while. She was thinking specifically about the fact that she had not fought harder before she signed off. She'd asked for updates. She'd noted in writing that she wanted to review the full investigation. But she had not picked up the phone and called the HR director and said, "Wait 9 years of nothing, and we're moving to termination in 4 days?" She hadn't done that. She'd let it move because she was busy, and she trusted Graham, and the process looked clean from the outside. The process had been designed to look clean from the outside. She was also thinking, less comfortably, about the fact that she barely knew who Caleb Whitaker was. She owned the company where he'd worked for 9 years, and she had no idea who he was beyond an employee number and a set of performance reviews until his name appeared in an incident report. That bothered her, in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with. She went back to her desk. She called her head of internal security, a former federal investigator named Patrick Ossie, who was compact and methodical, and who had an answering machine message that said, in a flat voice, "If this is urgent, text the word urgent, and I'll call back within 10 minutes." She texted the word urgent. Her phone rang in 6 minutes. 4 in the morning, Patrick said, not complaining, just noting it, the way he noted things. Sabrina said, "I need you to come in. I found something significant, and I need you to verify it before I take any action." Pause. How significant? Significant enough that I've been sitting here for 2 hours instead of calling you immediately because I wanted to make absolutely sure I wasn't wrong. For pause. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. He was there in 22. Patrick sat at the desk. She cleared for him and went through everything she'd pulled up, the footage, the access logs, the inventory records, the pattern of previous discrepancies, without speaking for a long time. He had the habit of being entirely still while he thought, unconscious fidgeting, shifting in the chair, which Sabrina had found unnerving when she first hired him and now found simply characteristic. When he finished, he sat back and folded his hands on the desk. "How thorough do you want this?" he said. "Thorough enough that there's nothing he can challenge," she said. "Thorough enough that when I stand in front of my employees and tell them what happened, I have the full picture and not just the visible part of it." Patrick nodded slowly. "That's going to take a few days." He's been careful. "Some of what he deleted is going to require forensic recovery. Take the time you need." "But Patrick," she paused. "This needs to stay contained. He doesn't know I've found this yet. I'd like to keep it that way." He looked at her. "You're not going to call the police tonight." "I'm going to call the police when I have everything. Before. If I move now, some of it disappears, and he lawyers up before we have the full scope." She held his gaze. "Can you work with that?" "It's the right call," Patrick said. "But the man who was fired—" "I know," Sabrina said. "What you're asking him to sit with for a few more days." She said again. She did know. It was not a comfortable thing to know. Yeah, she also understood that moving too fast would compromise the investigation and ultimately serve Caleb worse. And so she held the discomfort the way she held most uncomfortable things, not by pretending it wasn't there, by making the decision anyway and carrying the weight of it consciously. "I'll start with the forensic recovery tonight," Patrick said. "You should go home and sleep." "I will," she said. She was not going to, and they both knew it. But it was the kind of thing you said at 4:30 in the morning and nobody argued with. Patrick left her office and went to the server room. Sabrina sat at her desk and opened Caleb Whitaker's full employee file. She read through it, slowly the way she should have read through it before any of this happened. The early performance reviews from his first 2 years, when he was a floor associate. The recommendation from his first shift supervisor, a woman named Brenda Torres, who'd written, without being asked, "I want to note that Caleb Whitaker is exactly the type of employee this company should be working to keep. He is reliable in a way that goes beyond job description, and I believe he has genuine leadership potential." The merit reviews, the record of the team he'd built on the East Bay. In his file from 3 years back, handwritten by a department head who'd since retired, it said simply, "Good man." There were no personal details, of course. HR files didn't carry those. She didn't know he had a daughter. She didn't know he'd been doing this alone for 3 years, getting Maisie to school and to her after-school program, and making scrambled eggs every morning before the rest of the building was awake. Any of that yet. What she knew was the file. And the file told a story that was completely inconsistent with what Graham's report had claimed about him. Slightly inconsistent, fundamentally, irreconcilably inconsistent. And the fact that the inconsistency hadn't been enough to slow the process down was going to sit badly with her for a long time. Graham arrived at the office at 8:45 that morning, which was later than usual. He'd always been an 8 o'clock person, and the deviation was small enough that most people wouldn't have noticed. Sabrina noticed because she'd been watching the door. She was in the corridor outside her office when he stepped off the elevator. "Graham," she said. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man recalibrating quickly. She was used to seeing people recalibrate around her. She'd learned to read the micro-adjustment people made when they encountered her in a context they hadn't expected. Graham's adjustment was smooth, which told her he was good at it. "Sabrina," he said, with the comfortable familiarity he always used. "Early morning for you. Late night, actually," she said. "I've been in since 2. Something moved across his face. She caught it barely, and only because she was looking specifically for it, a brief, contained, calm sharpening of his attention that he immediately smoothed over. "The Chicago fallout still keeping you up," he said. "Something like that," she said. "I want to schedule a full review meeting this week. I'm doing a deep dive on the Redwood Falls security protocols, and I want your input." "Of course," he said easily. "My calendar's open Thursday." "Thursday works," she said. "And Graham, good work on the Whitaker situation." That wasn't easy. He held her gaze with the confidence of a man who believed he was the smartest person managing a particular piece of information. "These things never are," he said, "but it was the right call." "Right," she said. She let him go to his office. She went back to hers, sat down, and picked up the phone. She called Patrick. "How are we doing?" she said. "Recovered 70% of the deleted access logs," he said. "Found 2 additional vendor accounts that look suspicious." And Sabrina, a pause that she recognized as Patrick organizing something he wanted to say carefully. "This goes back further than 18 months. I'm finding transaction patterns that are at least 3 years old." She absorbed that. "Keep going," she said. "I intend to," he said. She sat back in her chair. Through the glass wall of her office, she could see the open floor of the executive-level desks, people arriving, the ordinary machinery of a corporate morning starting up. Graham's office was at the far end of the corridor, its door currently closed. She thought about Caleb Whitaker, sitting somewhere in Redwood Falls, employed, yet with a termination for theft on his record, trying to figure out what came next. She thought about the fact that it had been her company, her oversight, her signature on the form. A long time ago, before Northstar, before her father died, when she was still studying business administration and thinking about what kind of leader she wanted to be, she'd written a paper about institutional accountability, about the difference between an organization that performs responsibility and one that actually practices it. She'd gotten an A on it. She'd meant every word. She was about to find out whether she'd meant them enough to act on them when it cost her something. She picked up her coffee. It was cold again, or possibly still she'd stopped being able to tell. She drank it anyway. Down the corridor, through a closed door, Graham Pike sat at his desk and believed he was safe. He was going to believe that for exactly 3 more days. 3 days were the longest of Caleb Whitaker's adult life. Because he fell apart, he didn't, or at least not in any visible way. He got up every morning at 5:15 out of habit. Maisie's breakfast. Walked her to school. He and Anne came home to an apartment that felt different in the middle of the day than it did at 6 in the morning or 7 at night. It felt like a place that had been designed for a person who was supposed to be somewhere else. Quiet was a different quality than it was on weekends. It had a weight to it. He applied for jobs. He had a resume that he hadn't updated in 4 years, because people who aren't planning to leave don't keep their resumes current. And so he sat at the kitchen table on the first Wednesday morning after his termination and rebuilt it from scratch. He listened to Northstar last, and under the reason for leaving field, he stared at the blinking cursor for a long time before typing the words "position eliminated," which was not accurate, but was the only thing he could write that wouldn't immediately close every door he was trying to open. He applied to 3 logistics companies in the greater Redwood Falls area, 2 distribution centers in the next county over, and a freight coordination firm based in Minneapolis that had posted a supervisor position he was overqualified for. He sent every application with a cover letter he rewrote twice because the first draft was too careful, and the second was too honest, and the third was something in between that felt like neither, but he sent it anyway. While he waited for callbacks that didn't come not the first day, the second, he kept the apartment clean, picked Maisie up from school at 3:15, and cooked dinner every evening. He didn't tell her how tight the money was getting. She was 8. There were things you protected an 8-year-old from, and the specific of a checking account with $34 in it was one of them. But she knew something was wrong. She was Maisie, she always knew. On the second evening, she sat across from him at dinner, picking at her pasta and not eating the way she normally ate, which was with the focused efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be. "You've been home," she said. "Yeah. All day. Yeah." She twirled pasta around her fork and untwirled it. "Are you looking for a new job?" "I am. Is it hard to find one?" He looked at her. She was watching him carefully, with that particular expression she got when she was asking a question she already partially knew the answer to, but wanted him to confirm. "Takes some time," he said. "That's all. But we're okay," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "We're okay," he said. She ate the pasta. She didn't push it further. But that night, after he'd tucked her in, he found that she'd taken her piggy bank, a ceramic thing shaped like an actual pig that her grandmother had given her, stuffed with the accumulated coins and occasional dollar bills of 3 years of small windfalls, and moved it from her nightstand to the kitchen counter. She hadn't said anything about it. It was just there in the morning when he went to make breakfast. He stood looking at it for a minute, his hand on the coffee maker, and didn't trust himself to speak, even though there was nobody in the kitchen to speak to. He left it where she'd put it. He didn't touch it. On the third day, a Thursday, his phone rang at 11 in the morning. Didn't recognize the number, but it was a local area code, and he picked up. "Mr. Whitaker?" A woman's voice, professional neutral. "My name is Claire. I'm an assistant with the Northstar Executive Office. Ms. Lockwood would like to request a meeting with you. At your convenience, but she's hoping it could be this Friday morning, if that works." Caleb stood in his kitchen and held his phone very still. "Sabrina Lockwood," he said. It wasn't a question, but he said it anyway, because he needed a second to figure out what to do with what he was feeling. "Yes, sir. What does she want to meet about?" A brief pause, too brief to mean nothing, short enough to be professional. "I'm not in a position to share the details, but she asked me to tell you it's regarding your employment situation and that it's important." Caleb looked out the kitchen window at the parking lot below, where Mrs. Parrish's old Civic was parked in its usual spot, and a kid from the building next door was riding a bicycle in slow circles. "Friday morning," he said. "What time?" 9 o'clock. "At the Northstar Executive Office. I'll be there," he said. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a while longer. He did not know what a meeting with the CEO meant, whether it was a formality, a legal precaution, an attempt to settle something quietly before he decided to sue, or something else entirely. He'd known men who got called in for meetings like this after terminations and came out with a document that released the company from liability in exchange for a modest check. He'd one man who came out with nothing except the knowledge that the company had decided to make things official with the lawyers. He didn't let himself think it was good news. He had not earned the right to assume good news yet. But he called his neighbor, Marcus, that evening, not from the warehouse, just from his phone. The way you call someone who has been your coworker long enough to become something closer to a friend, and he told Marcus about the call. "She called you herself?" Marcus said. Her assistant called. "Same thing." A pause. "Caleb, the CEO doesn't call terminated employees through her personal assistant to offer them a settlement check. She has lawyers for that. I don't know what she wants, Marcus." "I think you might have some idea," Marcus said. "I think you might be sitting there not wanting to have that idea, because if you have it and it turns out to be wrong, that's a bad place to be." Caleb was quiet. "Yeah," he said eventually. "Well," Marcus said. "What happens?" He arrived at the Northstar Executive Building at 8:48 on Friday morning, which meant he sat in his car in the parking garage for 8 minutes because he was not going to walk in early, like a man who needed something badly. But he was also not going to walk in late, like a man who didn't take it seriously. He went in at 3 minutes to 9, told the lobby receptionist his name, and was directed to the 14th floor. Claire, the assistant, met him at the elevator. She was in her mid-30s, efficient without being cold, and she walked him down a corridor lined with framed photographs of Northstar facilities to a conference room at the far end of the floor that was not the kind of conference room you ended up in for termination paperwork. It was big. It had a long table, real chairs, and windows that looked out over the south side of the city. There were 3 people already in the room, a woman he didn't know, who was sitting with a folder of documents in front of her, a man he didn't know who had the composed, unreadable look of someone accustomed to being the most legally careful person in any room he entered, and Patrick Ossie, whom Caleb had seen once in passing at the facility during a security audit 2 years ago. And then Sabrina Lockwood came in. He recognized her from the company website, where her photo was professional and somewhat formal. She was younger looking than her photo, which surprised him, and she was moving with a purposefulness that suggested she'd been in motion since very early this morning and had only partially stopped. She wore a charcoal blazer over a dark blouse, no jewelry except for a watch, and she looked like someone who had not slept particularly well. She saw him when she came through the door and walked directly to him, hand extended. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "thank you for coming. I'm Sabrina Lockwood." He shook her hand. "I know who you are," he said. Something flickered in her expression, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. "Please, sit down." He sat. She sat across from him, not at the head of the table, but on the same side as the other people, which he noticed. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said, "because I think you deserve that, and I've already wasted enough of your time with the opposite approach." She set her hands flat on the table. "What happened to you was wrong. You did not steal from this company. You were deliberately framed, and our investigation mind specifically, because I should have asked harder questions from the start, failed to catch that before we terminated your employment. I'm sorry for that." Caleb looked at her. She held his gaze without looking away, which told him she wasn't reading the apology off a script, she was actually saying it. "You found something," he said. "We found a great deal," she said. "Patrick is going to walk you through it in full, because you have every right to know exactly what was done and exactly what evidence we have. The short version is that your operations director, Graham Pike, has been systematically stealing from this company for at least 3 years. When the scale of the operation reached a point where discovery was becoming likely, he chose you to take the fall for it." Caleb sat very still. "He used my badge records," Caleb said. "It wasn't a question. He falsified your access logs remotely. He also manipulated the inventory documentation using your completed paperwork you'd already signed off on the intake, which meant your signature was legitimately on the documents. And he altered the surrounding records to imply you'd had ongoing access to the shipment after logging it in." She paused. It was a sophisticated operation. He'd done versions of it before, on a smaller scale. Caleb was looking at the table. He was thinking about the conference room, the other conference room, the one on the administrative floor, with the photograph of the Redwood Falls skyline. And Graham sliding that page across the table with his expensive shirt and his practiced certainty. "Where is he now?" Caleb said. "He was removed from the building yesterday afternoon," Sabrina said. "Police have been involved since Wednesday. Patrick can give you the specifics of the legal situation." Caleb nodded slowly. He wasn't feeling what he would have expected to feel. He'd thought, in the dark of the apartment, on the nights when he let himself imagine this conversation, he would feel something large and definitive: relief, vindication, anger finally released. What he actually felt was more complicated and less clean. There was relief, yes, but underneath it was something tired and sour, the particular weariness of a person who has spent 10 days being wrong about, and who has had to carry that in front of their kid and their coworkers and their own mirror. "I need to walk back through what happened," Sabrina said, "in a way that doesn't leave you with any ambiguity. I want to be specific." She glanced at the woman with the folder, who opened it and slid several pages toward Caleb. What followed was 40 minutes, during which Patrick and the woman, whose name was Diane, and who turned out to be Northstar's external legal counsel, took Caleb through the full investigation. The security footage from Thursday evening played on a screen that descended from the ceiling at the end of the table. Graham entering the secure bay in the hooded Northstar jacket. Graham supervising the loading of every carton onto the unmarked truck. The timestamp on the access log that placed Caleb's badge in the bay, an hour after the shipment was already gone. The forensic recovery of the deleted records, the financial transactions across 18 months that mapped to merchandise Northstar had written off as inventory variance. The 3 previous incidents, smaller and quieter, that nobody had flagged because they hadn't been large enough individually. Caleb watched all of it. He watched Graham's face on the security footage, clear and recognizable on camera 12. At the angle Patrick had found moving through the bay with the calm confidence of a man who believed he'd covered every angle. He watched it and he felt the anger arrive. Finally, it arrived quietly, the way he'd imagined. It was not hot. It was cold and specific, and it settled somewhere behind his sternum and sat there without moving. He picked me because of my record, Caleb said when Patrick had finished. Patrick looked at him carefully. That's our assessment. Yes. An employee with no disciplinary history, good standing, who handled the shipment legitimately, and whose signature was already on the documents. The framing required minimum additional fabrication because your fingerprints, procedurally speaking, were already on the paperwork. He used 9 years of clean work against me, Caleb said. Patrick said, not dressing it up. Caleb sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Sabrina. You said your investigation failed, he said. You said you should have asked harder questions. That's correct, she said. Why didn't you? He wasn't asking it aggressively, he genuinely wanted to know. And he could see that she understood the difference, because she didn't react defensively. No. She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense that she'd been sitting with this question herself. I was in Chicago when the report came in, she said. Came back, I reviewed Graham's summary, and I signed off on a provisional basis because I was tired, and because Graham had 11 years of my trust, and because she stopped. Restarted. Because I didn't fight hard enough against the momentum of a process that was already moving. And that's not a good enough reason. There isn't a good enough reason for what happened to you. He looked at her. She was 30 years old, he remembered. Younger than him. She owned the company and she had the corner office and the title. And right now she looked like a person who was genuinely carrying something uncomfortable and not trying to put it down until it was resolved. He respected that. He didn't say so, but he respected it. Okay, he said. I want to discuss what comes next, Sabrina said. Your employment record will be formally cleared today. Diane has the paperwork ready, and you'll receive a full written restoration of your record with documentation you can use for any future employer. Your lost wages for the period between your termination and today will be restored in full. And I owe you a formal company-wide apology, which is part of what I'd like to do this morning, if you're willing. Caleb looked at her. What do you mean, company-wide? The staff at the Redwood Falls facility, she said. The people who watched you leave. I'd like to call an emergency meeting this morning. I'd like to play the footage and present the evidence in front of everyone who was in that building when Graham walked you out of it. She paused. I think you're owed that, but I also want to be clear that it's your call. If you'd rather this be handled quietly, we can do that. Thought about Marcus in the parking lot. He thought about the way the warehouse floor had gone quiet that morning, and how nobody had stopped moving. Only Marcus had said anything, and the rest had just kept working. The best employee on the East Bay wasn't walking out the door with a box of his belongings. Thought about Maisie's piggy bank on the kitchen counter, moved there without a word. I want the meeting, he said. The Northstar Redwood Falls facility was 20 minutes from the executive building. Sabrina made 2 phone calls from the back of the car during the drive, both brief, and by the time they arrived, Caleb could see through the windshield that the parking lot had a different quality to it than a normal Friday morning cars parked in clusters. People standing near the entrance who should have been on the floor by now. The low hum of a building that had been told something was happening without being told what. Donna met them at the door. She saw Caleb first. Her face went through several things in quick succession: surprise, Yes, recognition. Something that might have been relief, and then a kind of braced uncertainty, as if she was trying to read whether he was here in anger or something else. Caleb, she said. Donna, he said. She looked at Sabrina. Conference room is ready. Most of the floor staff are assembled. Sabrina said. Let's go in. The main conference room at the Redwood Falls facility was not large enough for the entire floor staff comfortably, which meant people were standing along the walls and sitting on window ledges and crowding the doorway in the way that people do when something significant is happening, and they've decided it's worth being uncomfortable to witness. Caleb walked in behind Sabrina and Patrick, and he felt every head in the room turn. He saw Marcus near the back wall, standing with two other forklift operators Caleb had worked alongside for years. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not quite into certainty, but in the direction of it. He saw people from his team. He saw people from other shifts. He saw the overnight supervisor, a young guy named Dario, who'd been working at Northstar for about a year, and who'd heard the story of what happened secondhand, and now looked slightly confused about what was currently happening. He saw near the front of the room a few of the management staff who'd been present in various capacities during the investigation. One of them, a mid-level manager named Steve, who'd always been cordial to Caleb, avoided his eyes. Another looked directly at him, and then looked quickly at the screen. Graham Pike was not there. Graham Pike's empty chair, at the seat he normally occupied in company meetings, was somehow louder than anything else in the room. Sabrina stood at the front. She did not use notes. "Thank you for being here," she said. "I'll be brief about the context, and then I'll show you what we found, because I think the evidence speaks more clearly than anything I can say." She was direct about it. She did not soften the edges or use corporate language that obscured what had actually happened. She laid it out: the missing shipment, the initial investigation, Caleb's termination, yes, then her own review of the footage on Tuesday night. She said, out loud and without qualification, that Caleb Whitaker had been innocent and had been deliberately set up by a member of their own leadership. Then she played the footage. The conference room was silent in a way that Caleb had rarely experienced in a room with that many people in it. He watched the screen. He watched Graham in the hooded jacket supervising the removal of the electronics. He watched the timestamp on the access log appearing against an empty bay. He watched the financial records scroll across the screen while Patrick narrated the pattern they represented. He heard from somewhere in the room a sharp, exhaled breath. He heard someone say Jesus very quietly, under their breath, not as profanity, but as the kind of involuntary release that comes from seeing something you hadn't anticipated. He heard Marcus make a sound that was low and tight and not quite a word. When the footage finished, Sabrina turned to face the room. "Graham Pike has been removed from this company and turned over to law enforcement," she said. "The full investigation findings have been provided to the police. The legal process will continue from here." She paused. "What I want to say to everyone in this room is that what happened should not have happened. The theft, that was Graham's doing, and he will answer for it. But the speed with which we moved to terminate an employee with a 9-year clean record without complete and thorough independent review is a failure of this company's process. It is a failure I am responsible for, and it is going to change." She looked at Caleb. "I'd like to ask Caleb Whitaker to come forward," she said. This is coming, she'd told him in the car, but walking to the front of a room full of people who'd watched him leave in disgrace 10 days ago was not something you could fully prepare for. He was aware of the weight of every set of eyes in the room. He was aware of the involuntary straightening of his spine, the deliberate steadiness of his pace, the way his face was doing the thing it did when he needed to hold something together. He stopped next to Sabrina. She faced him in front of the room. "On behalf of Northstar Distribution," she said, "I am sorry. I am sorry for what was done to you, and I am sorry that this company's process failed to protect an innocent employee from a deliberate and calculated injustice. Your record has been fully cleared. Your lost wages will be returned." She held his gaze. What you are owed goes beyond what I can put in a paycheck, and I understand that. But I want to start by making sure everyone in this room hears me say it plainly. Caleb Whitaker did nothing wrong. The room was still. Then Marcus started clapping. It wasn't thunderous, it started as Marcus's hands and spread outward the way sound does when it has been given permission, until most of the room had joined it, and the conference room had the particular complicated quality of a space where a wrong thing was being undone in real time, and the people witnessing it didn't quite have the emotional vocabulary for the occasion. Caleb stood at the front of the room and took it. He didn't smile exactly. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing something he wasn't fully in control of, and he thought about 9 years of arriving early, and about Maisie's piggy bank on the kitchen counter, and about the way that cold, specific anger had settled behind his sternum, and whether it was ever fully going to leave. Thought about what he wanted to say. And when the room quieted, he said it simply, without a speech, just the words that were actually true. I want to say thank you, he said, to Ms. Lockwood for doing this right. And to the people in this room who knew me, who knew this didn't fit. That mattered, even when nobody said anything out loud. He looked at Marcus. Marcus gave him a nod that was small and sufficient. And I want to say that what happened to me can happen to anyone in this room. Let's make sure it doesn't. It was not a perfect speech. It was not even a very long one. But it was his, and it landed the way true things land when there are enough people in the room who needed to hear them. Afterward, he stayed in the corridor outside the conference room, while Patrick and Diane were inside answering questions from management staff. Sabrina found Caleb standing near the windows that looked out onto the loading docks. He was watching the floor below the ordinary business of a Friday morning, forklifts and pallets and dock doors. "How are you doing?" she asked. "I'm not entirely sure yet," he said honestly. She leaned against the wall and looked out the same window. "That's a reasonable answer." They stood there for a moment in the awkward, unscripted space that follows big things when the structure around them dissolves, and there's nothing left but the people involved. "You said you want things to change," he said. "I meant it. It has to be structural, not a memo. Actual process independent review before termination, mandatory waiting period for high-value misconduct cases, someone who is inside the chain of accusation doing the verification." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for 10 days. She looked at him. "I can imagine. I've got some thoughts. I'd like to hear them," she said. He looked back out at the loading docks. The October sky above them was pale and flat, the kind of sky that couldn't decide yet what it was going to be. "Okay," he said. He thought about calling Maisie's school and asking them to tell her to wait. He was coming a little late for pickup. He thought about what he was going to say when he walked through the door that evening, how he was going to explain this to an 8-year-old in a way that was honest and not too much and still true. He thought that the worst 10 days of his adult life had happened, that they were over, and that the anger behind his sternum was still there, but had shifted slightly, not gone, different, but pointed now at something he could use it for. He thought about Maisie saying, in the low light of her room, "Then that's what matters." He was going to get to tell her she was right. He drove home with the windows down, despite the October cold. He needed the air. He needed the specific sensation of the temperature and the noise of the city moving past him, the ordinary sounds of a Friday afternoon tires on pavement, someone's radio at a red light, dog barking somewhere off to the left, because he needed proof that the world outside his own head was still running normally. This morning had actually happened, and he wasn't going to walk into the apartment and discovering he'd been sitting at the kitchen table the whole time. He picked Maisie up at 3:15. She came through the school's front door with a backpack riding too low, the way she always wore it, and her jacket unzipped even though it was 42 degrees, and she saw his car in the pickup line and walked to it without hurrying the way she did everything. Climbed in and pulled the door shut and looked at him. She looked at him the way she always did, reading his face before she said anything, and whatever she found there was different from what she'd found for the last 10 days, because her own expression shifted in a way she didn't control. "Something happened," she said. "Yeah," he said. Good something or bad something. He pulled out of the pickup line and onto the street and kept his eyes forward for a moment before he answered, because he was trying to figure out how to do this right. He'd thought about it the whole drive back from Northstar. He'd thought about what version of this story was the right size for an 8-year-old, and what version was too small, and what version was too large. And he'd decided somewhere on the highway that Maisie was not a kid who benefited from things being sized wrong for her. Good something, he said. Really good, he told her. All of it, not the forensic recovery, or the financial transaction records, or the specifics of what Patrick had found in the deleted logs. The shape of it, the essential truth of it, that a woman named Sabrina Lockwood owned Northstar, had looked at the security footage herself and found the real person who took the shipment, and that person was not her father, and everyone at the company now knew it. Maisie listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She sat with her backpack in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she watched the road on top of it, the way she saw ahead of them, the way she sometimes watched things when she was processing something that required more than her normal attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So they know you didn't do it," she said. "And the guy who actually did it. The police have him," Caleb said. "He's going to go through a legal process and answer for what he did." Pause. In the precise, serious voice of a child who had spent 10 days holding something together. "I knew it." "You did." "I told you," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word, not dramatically, just a small fracture in it. The kind that happens when you've been holding something too carefully for too long, and you finally get to put it down. He reached over and put his hand briefly on top of her folded hands. She turned her hand over and squeezed his fingers once, quickly, and then let go and looked back out the windshield. "Can we get pizza?" she said. He laughed. It came out slightly uneven, but it was real. He said, "We can get pizza." They got pizza. They sat across from each other, in the same booth they always took, at the same place they'd been going since Maisie was 5, and she ate 3 slices while telling him, extensive detail, about a disagreement in her class, about whether a book they were reading was boring or just slow, and her position was that slow and boring were not the same thing, and people needed to learn the difference. He listened and ate and refilled her water glass when she drained it, and it was the most ordinary evening he'd had in almost 2 weeks, and it was the best he could remember in longer than that. When they got home, he moved the piggy bank back to her room. She saw him do it and didn't say anything, but when she went to bed that night, she left her door open a crack instead of closed, which she hadn't done since she was 6. He noticed it from the hallway when he went to turn off the kitchen light. He stood there for a moment looking at the thin line of light from her nightlight showing under the gap. Then he went and sat at the kitchen table with his phone and a piece of paper and began writing down what he'd told Sabrina he'd been thinking about for 10 days. Because that conversation was going to happen, and he intended to be ready for it. The formal offer came the following Tuesday. He drove to the executive office again, this time without the tight-chested uncertainty of the previous week, and sat across from Sabrina and Diane in a smaller conference room that felt more like a working meeting and less like a proceeding. Claire brought coffee, actual good coffee, not the conference room stuff, and Sabrina had a legal pad in front of her with handwritten notes that told Caleb she'd been thinking about the conversation herself. Diane outlined the offer. Regional Operations Director, based out of the Redwood Falls Executive Office, overseeing security protocol and employee protection procedures across 4 Northstar facilities. Salary that was, in concrete terms, more than twice what he'd been making as a floor supervisor. Benefits, equity participation, a formal mandate to redesign the investigation and termination process from the ground up. Caleb listened to all of it. He did not say yes immediately. "I want to understand something first," he said, when Diane had finished. He looked at Sabrina. "This isn't a goodwill gesture. You're not offering me this position because you feel bad about what happened," Sabrina said. "I'm offering it because you're the right person for it." You understand what went wrong from the inside in a way that nobody currently in this building does. And you've already been thinking about the structural fixes, which tells me you'd be doing this work whether or not you had the title. I'd be doing it from the outside without the title, he said. Making noise and probably not getting very far. Which is a waste, she said. He looked at the offered document in front of him. He looked at the number. Thought about the apartment with the drafty windows and the dripping faucet he'd been meaning to fix. And he thought about Maisie's school tuition for this year, and the fact that he'd been quietly calculating whether she'd need to change schools, and he hated that he'd been calculating that. But he also thought about what he'd told Sabrina in the corridor at Redwood Falls, and he needed to know she'd actually heard it. No. If I take this, he said, I need it to be real. Not a committee. Not a review board that generates reports nobody reads. Actual structural change, mandatory independent investigation before any termination for serious misconduct, a waiting period during which the accused employee's access to legal resources is guaranteed, and a clear chain of escalation that bypasses the direct management of whoever's making the accusation. Sabrina nodded. I want all of that. Because you want it? Or because it's the right thing and you understand you'd be implementing it regardless of whether you want it? She looked at him for a moment, not put off by the question, actually considering it. She said, and I think those being the same answer is the point. He held her gaze. She was direct in a way he hadn't expected, not in the polished, rehearsed directness of executives he'd encountered at Northstar events over the years. In the way of someone who had decided that being indirect cost more than it's worth and had made their peace with that even when it made rooms uncomfortable. Picked up the pen. He signed. Diane gathered the papers with the efficient satisfaction of a person who had spent the morning preparing for a specific outcome and was glad to have reached it. Sabrina uncapped her water bottle, and, in the small action of it, the ordinary, slightly distracted gesture of someone whose brain had already moved to the next item, Caleb saw something he recognized. Particular quality of a person who is always halfway into the next problem. He knew that quality. He lived with it himself. When do you want me to start? He said. Monday works, she said. But this week, if you have time, I'd like to sit down and go through your structural proposals in detail. Patrick will be involved. Legal will need to review the process changes before we implement them, which means we need to build the framework first. I have time this week, he said, which was the understatement of the year, but he said it without inflection. She almost smiled at that. It was brief and slightly sideways and disappeared quickly, but it was there. Thursday afternoon, she said. Thursday works. He drove home and called Marcus. She offered you a job, Marcus said. He wasn't asking. Regional Operations Director. A pause so long Caleb thought the call had dropped. You're serious. She wants me to redesign the entire investigation and termination process. Employee protection protocols across 4 facilities. Other pause. That's. Marcus seemed to be hunting for the right word and deciding that none of the available ones were quite adequate. That's the right call. That's actually the right call. Thought so, Caleb said. Are you nervous? He thought about that honestly. A little, he said. I've never done work at that level. You've done the work, Marcus said, just not with the title. It was a simple observation, the kind Marcus made sometimes, without seeming to realize how accurate they were. Held on to it. Starting Monday, he showed up at the executive office at 8 a.m. and spent the first week learning the landscape of his new position, the organizational charts, the current protocols, the gaps between what the employee handbook said should happen during a misconduct investigation and what actually happened in practice. He read through 6 years of incident reports. He interviewed department heads across 2 facilities. He talked to Donna, who was careful at first, and then gradually more honest, who told him things about the existing process that confirmed what he already suspected. The investigation framework wasn't broken because people were lazy. It was broken because it had been built around the assumption that management was trustworthy by default, and it had never been stress-tested against a scenario where management was the problem. He wrote his proposals in the evenings at the kitchen table, after Maisie was in bed, with a cup of coffee that sometimes went cold. He wrote them in plain language, a practical, concrete way. He'd always processed problems, not starting with principles and working outward, but starting with the specific failure mode and working backward to the structural gap that had allowed it. Thursday came. He sat down with Sabrina and Patrick in the smaller conference room and went through it. He'd prepared 12 pages. He walked them through every piece, the mandatory independent investigator requirement, the guaranteed legal resource access for accused employees, cross-department protocol that prevented any single management chain from controlling both the accusation and the investigation, the mandatory 48-hour review period before termination in any case involving potential criminal conduct. Sabrina read every page while he talked. She didn't look up often. When she did, it was to ask a specific question, not a soft question, a diplomatic one. The kind of question that was actually trying to understand something, rather than looking for confirmation. He appreciated that. He had spent 9 years in meetings where executives asked questions that were dressed-up opinions, and he had always found it exhausting. This part, she said, tapping a page. Cross-department verification. You're proposing that it's triggered automatically, regardless of the confidence level of the initial report. Yes, he said, which means even cases where the evidence seems unambiguous. Especially those, he said, because the cases where the evidence seems unambiguous are the ones that move fastest and leave the least room for error. Graham's report looked unambiguous. That's what he built it to look like. She was quiet for a moment. You're right, she said. She wrote something on her legal pad. Patrick, any security complications with the cross-department access requirements? Some, Patrick said. We'll need to define the scope carefully. Broad investigative access to sensitive records creates its own vulnerability if the process is abused. That's a fair concern, Caleb said. I was thinking the independent investigator role would need to be externally certified someone who isn't a company employee and who operates under a separate accountability structure, like an outside auditor, but for misconduct investigations. Patrick nodded slowly. That addresses the internal conflict of interest problem. Creates a cost, Sabrina said. It does, Caleb said. Less than the cost of what just happened. She looked at him. Then she wrote something else on her legal pad and turned to the next page. They worked through all 12 pages in 3 hours. By the end, Sabrina had marked up roughly half of Caleb's proposals, with additions or modifications, and he'd pushed back on 3 of hers, and she'd acknowledged 2 of the 3, which he found was a reasonable rate for a first working session with someone he'd known for less than 2 weeks. Yes. When Patrick left to take a call, where it was just the 2 of them, at the table, with empty coffee cups and a spread of marked-up pages between them, and Sabrina was reviewing something she'd written, and Caleb was reading back through a section he wanted to revise. And the silence was simply the silence of 2 people working, without any of the formal tension that had surrounded every previous interaction. Up and caught him, glancing at the page she was reviewing. Is this still about the cross-department protocol? She said. He said, I was looking at your notes. You changed the language in section 3. I strengthened it. I saw. I think you're right. She raised an eyebrow slightly. You're not going to push back? Push back when I disagree. I don't push back to demonstrate that I push back. She looked at him for a moment, in the way she sometimes did when something he said landed differently than she expected. Then she went back to her page. My father used to say that the people who were the most valuable to him were the ones who knew the difference between those 2 things, she said, without looking up. It was the first time she'd mentioned her father to him. He noted it the way you note a door opening, slightly not pushing it, just aware it was there. He built this company, Caleb said. He did, she said. He built it and then he died and left it to me, and the manual was somewhat incomplete. A beat. That's understated. I gathered, Caleb said. She glanced up. The sideways almost smile again, quicker this time. What gave it away? The security system upgrade 2 years ago. You pushed that through over 2 executives' objections, according to Patrick. People don't usually fight that hard for infrastructure improvements in systems they fully trust. She was quiet for a moment. You noticed that. I read the upgrade proposal in the file, he said. You cited 3 specific failure modes in the legacy system that hadn't triggered any incidents yet, which means you were thinking ahead of the problem. I was lucky, she said. If I hadn't upgraded when I did, we might not have had the camera angles that caught Graham clearly. Luck favors the paranoid, he said. She laughed at that, a real one, brief and slightly surprised, the kind of laugh that happens before the person decides whether to let it out. He stored that away, somewhere he didn't fully examine. The work settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Caleb moved from the conference room into an actual office smaller than Sabrina's, 1 floor down, a window, with a view of the parking garage that he found perfectly adequate. He brought the framed photograph of Maisie from the cardboard box, now unpacked and relocated, and set it on the desk next to his notebook. Structural proposals moved through legal and came back with modifications. Revised. They went back. He attended meetings he'd never been in rooms for before, with board members and compliance officers and external auditors, and he said what he thought and learned what he didn't know and added the latter to the running list he kept in his notebook. He was not the most polished person in any of those meetings. He didn't have the MBA vocabulary or the boardroom fluency that came from years of moving in those spaces. But he had something that was proving more useful than he'd expected, the specific credibility of a person who had come through the wrong end of the process he was now redesigning, who had the details memorized in a way that no consultant or policy writer could replicate. People listened to him in those meetings in a way he hadn't anticipated. Because of the title, he'd learned early that titles moved information around rooms in predictable ways that were only loosely connected to who actually knew what. They listened because he was specific and because the specificity was grounded in something real, and because everyone in those rooms understood, at some level, what had happened to Caleb Whitaker could happen to anyone in the company if the process stayed broken. He and Sabrina developed a working language. It was not immediate. The first 2 weeks had the careful formality of 2 people feeling out how much candor the professional relationship could hold. Were moments of friction. She moved fast and sometimes decided things in directions he hadn't been consulted on. And the first time it happened, he told her directly that if she wanted his input to be meaningful, it needed to be part of the decision, not a review of it after the fact. She'd been quiet for a moment and then said evenly that he was right, and then she'd called him into the next decision before it was made. He appreciated that she didn't apologize excessively. He found excessive apology in professional settings almost as difficult to work with as no apology at all, because it usually meant the person was managing their own discomfort rather than actually adjusting. Sabrina said she was wrong when she was wrong, clearly and without embellishment, and then moved on. He respected it. On a Wednesday evening in late November, 5 weeks after he'd started, he was finishing up a revised section of the termination protocol framework when Sabrina appeared in his doorway. He looked up. She was still in her work clothes, which meant she'd been in the building late, which was not unusual. She had a folder under one arm and looked like she was on her way somewhere else and had stopped without planning to. Still here, she said. Finishing the Section 4 revision, he said. You were right about the escalation window. 72 hours is more defensible than 48, she said, without satisfaction, just noting it. She looked at the framed photo on his desk, the one she'd never asked about directly. Is that your daughter? Yeah. Maisie, how old? Almost 9. She looked at the photo for a moment. Maisie was holding the second-place science fair ribbons with both hands and grinning in that particular contained way of hers, like she was pleased, but didn't want to make a thing of it. No. She looks like she's got opinions about things, Sabrina said. That's the most accurate description of her I've heard, Caleb said. Sabrina looked at the photo a moment longer, and something in her expression was different than the working expression she wore, through most of the day quieter and slightly unguarded. Then she seemed to become aware of the difference and shifted slightly. "So, I'm going to grab dinner," she said. "There's a place 3 blocks over that does decent Thai. If you're finishing up anyway." She paused. "Not a meeting. Just dinner." He looked at her. She was 30 years old and she owned a company. And she was standing in his doorway at 7 p.m. with a folder under her arm and the slightly braced quality of someone who didn't ask this kind of thing often and wasn't entirely sure what to do with having asked it. "Give me 10 minutes to finish this section," he said. "'Kay," she said, and went back into the corridor. He finished the section, saved the document, put on his jacket. On his way out, he paused at his desk and looked at the photo of Maisie and her ribbon for a moment. He thought about the version of this evening that would have existed if nothing had changed, if he was still the eBay supervisor going home to a dripping faucet and a $34 checking account, and the specific loneliness of a life. Was full enough to not feel lonely most of the time, and then occasionally felt very lonely. He turned off the office light and went to meet her. Thai place was small, warm, and slightly too crowded for a Wednesday, which meant they ended up at a corner table near the kitchen, where the ambient noise made it feel less like a business than it might have otherwise. Yes, he'd intervened. They ordered without looking at the menu for long. They'd both been working through dinner's skipping days, and hunger had a way of making decision-making direct, and the food came quickly. She told him about a board call she'd had that afternoon, and what had been said, and what hadn't been said, in the way that people sometimes talk about their day when they're in the company of someone they've decided they can be honest around. He told her about the resistance he'd gotten from a regional manager at the Minneapolis facility, No Sinsistiki, who was treating the new investigation protocols as an inconvenience rather than a protection. "Send me his name," she said. "I'll make a call." "I don't need you to make calls on my behalf," he said. "I need to be able to handle the pushback myself if this is going to work long term." She stopped with her fork halfway to her plate. "That's fair. I'll go to Minneapolis next week," he said. "Face-to-face works better for this than email." "Do you need backup for that?" "Not yet, but I'll let you know." She nodded. She ate. She asked him something about the escalation framework, and told her what he was thinking, and she pushed back on one piece of it, adjusted note D, and for a while they worked through it across a corner table with plates of pad, CU between them and the kitchen noise around them, which was not the conventional setting for building institutional policy, but was, as far as Caleb could tell, entirely effective. Then the food was finished, and the bill came, and they split it without discussing it, and there was a pause in which the working conversation had ended, and of them had stood up yet. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sabrina said. "Sure," he said. "How do you do it? The being a single parent while also being the person everyone's counting on at work. I watch you, and you're present in both things, and I don't understand how you don't drop something." He looked at her. It wasn't a hollow question she was genuinely asking. "I drop things all the time," he said. "I just try to make sure they're the things that can be picked back up." He paused. "Maisie's the non-negotiable. Everything else gets organized around that." "Doesn't that make everything else harder?" "It makes everything else clearer," he said. "When you know exactly what the priority is, the other decisions are simpler." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "I'm not good at knowing what the priority is," she said. "I'm good at everything feeling equally urgent." "I know," he said. "I've watched you work." She looked up. "Is that a critique?" "It's an observation. You carry a lot that could be redistributed." "A beat. Is that what you're doing? Redistributing it?" "Trying to," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the warm, busy noise of the restaurant. Outside, through the small front window, Caleb could see the November street people, in coats moving past, yellow wash of streetlights on wet pavement. A normal Wednesday in Redwood Falls. "Thank you," she said, "for the work you're doing. I mean it separately from all of it. Just for the work. It's the right work," he said. "That makes it easier." They put on their coats and went back out into the cold. They walked the 3 blocks back to the parking garage without talking much, which was not uncomfortable, the way it would have been 5 weeks ago. The cold air had the particular sharpness of a Minnesota November that has stopped shy about what it intends, and their breath showed in the glow of the building's entrance lights when they reached the garage. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. He drove home. The apartment was quiet, Mrs. Parrish had put Maisie to bed at 8, per their arrangement on late evenings, and he checked on Maisie, who was asleep with one arm hanging off the mattress, exactly the same way she'd been sleeping since she was 3 years old. And he stood in the doorway and did the quiet accounting of her that he'd done every day of her life. Then he went to the kitchen. That fixed the faucet he'd bought the part 2 weeks ago, and kept meaning to get to it, and it only took 20 minutes, and it stopped, and he stood at the sink and ran the water. And listened to the clean, uninterrupted sound of it. Thought about the cold anger that had lived behind his sternum for 10 days, and was now something else, entirely still there. Still informing things, but converted into something he was building with. That was the best use he knew for that kind of anger, and he figured it was probably the best any person could do with it. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. He did not think about what came next. He just sat for a while in the quiet apartment, with the facade fixed and his daughter asleep down the hall and the work waiting for him in the morning, and let it be enough. It was enough. No. The Minneapolis trip happened on a Tuesday, which Caleb thought was appropriate, given that another Tuesday, 11 weeks earlier, had been the day his old life ended. He drove up instead of flying because the drive was 3.5 hours, and he wanted the time to think, and because thinking while moving had always worked better for him than thinking while sitting still. He left at 5:30 in the morning, before Maisie was awake, and Mrs. Parrish had agreed to see her to school. His kits init tizinde. He put a note on the kitchen counter where Maisie would find it with her breakfast back tonight. Eggs in the fridge. Don't forget your jacket. And drove north through the early dark, with a thermos of coffee wedged between the seat and the center console. The regional manager's name was Dale Coffey. He was 51, had run the Minneapolis facility for 7 years, and had made clear in 3 separate emails that the new investigation protocols were his professional assessment, an operational burden that would slow down legitimate misconduct cases and create a legal liability the company wasn't prepared for. His emails were polished and used words like framework and implementation timeline in ways that suggested he'd thought carefully about how to sound reasonable while disagreeing with everything. Caleb had read all 3 emails. He'd also pulled Dale's facility record, which showed 2 misconduct terminations in month, under 72 hours each, both resulting in separation agreements with non-disclosure clauses. He drove and thought about that. The Northstar Minneapolis facility was larger than Redwood Falls, more loading bays, more staff, a higher daily freight volume. Dale Coffey met him in the lobby, with the particular energy of a man who had agreed to a meeting he didn't want, and had decided to be professional about it in a way that communicated the disagreement clearly. He was thick-shouldered with a graying crew cut and a firm handshake, and he walked Caleb through the facility before they sat down, which was a power move Caleb recognized as such, and let go without comment. They sat in Dale's office. It was a bigger office than Caleb's, practically furnished, a window that looked directly onto the warehouse floor in the way that supervisory offices and logistic facilities were designed to do, always watching, always visible. "I appreciate you making the drive," Dale said. "I want to be clear that my concerns about the protocol aren't about resistance for resistance' sake." "Tell me what they are," Caleb said. Dale laid it out. The 48-hour mandatory hold before termination was the main sticking point. He cited a specific scenario where an employee had been caught on camera stealing cash from a coworker's bag and had been separated within 24 hours to prevent further incidents. Under the new protocol, that employee would have remained on site for 2 additional days. "That's a real problem," Caleb said. Dale looked slightly surprised to hear him say it. "It is. The mandatory hold applies to misconduct investigations where the accusation is being investigated, not where the conduct is directly observed and documented, Caleb said. If you have footage of an employee stealing from a coworker's bag, that's not an allegation under investigation. That's documented evidence. The protocol has a carve-out for that scenario, Section 7, Paragraph 3. You remove the employee from the affected area immediately for workplace safety. The hold still applies to the termination paperwork, but the physical separation happens right away. Was quiet for a moment. I missed that carve-out. The document's long, Caleb said. I wrote it. A beat. Dale looked at him, with the expression of a man recalibrating. Your situation at Redwood Falls. I heard about it. Most people in this company have by now, Caleb said, without any particular inflection. Which is part of why I'm here. Because I want you to understand that I built this protocol from the inside. It's exactly what it's designed to prevent. From a legal theory. From what it feels like to have your badge records falsified and your signature used against you and to be terminated in 4 days with no independent review. He paused. The scenario you're worried about an obvious case slowing down, that's a real concern, and I built the carve-outs to address it. The scenario I lived through is the one that keeps coming if we don't build the structure. Dale looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back up. What do you need from me? I need you to read the full document. The summary. The full thing. And I need you to send me the 2 termination cases from the past 18 months, the ones that closed with NDAs, so I can review them against the new framework. Something moved across Dale's face. Not guilt. Exactly more like the particular discomfort of a person who has been operating in a gray area they hadn't examined closely. Those cases were clean, he said. Then the review will confirm that, Caleb said. And if there's anything in them that the new process would have flagged, I'd rather know that now than later. A long pause. I'll send them today, Dale said. Caleb drove home in the early dark of a November evening, thermos empty, thinking about Dale Coffey's face in that last pause. He didn't think Dale was Graham Pike. He thought Dale was something more common, and in some ways more complicated, a manager who had run his facility the way he'd been taught to run it, without malicious intent. Intervened in a system that had never forced him to ask whether the way he'd been taught was the right way. Was most people, Caleb had come to understand. The Grahams were rare. The system that allowed the Grahams to operate was built from the accumulated choices of the Dales, good faith people, running processes they hadn't designed and hadn't questioned, because questioning them required a reason. The reason usually didn't arrive until after the damage was done. He got home at 8:40. Mrs. Parrish had fed Maisie dinner, and Maisie was in her pajamas doing a word search at the kitchen table, which was what she did in the evenings when she was waiting for him without admitting she was waiting. She looked up when he came in. You look tired. I am tired, he said. He dropped his bag and sat across from her. Good day? Decent, she said. We had a substitute in science who didn't know what she was doing, so I got a lot of the word search finished during class. She said it without apology. How was Minneapolis? Productive. Is the guy going to cooperate? He looked at her. She was 9 now. Her birthday had been 3 weeks ago. A small dinner with Mrs. Parrish and Marcus's wife. A chocolate cake that Maisie had specifically requested have exactly 1 candle because, she explained. She didn't see why the number of candles had to correspond to the age when 1 candle was the correct amount of candle. He had been delighted by this reasoning. He'll cooperate, Caleb said. She went back to her word search. There's leftover pasta in the fridge. Mrs. Parrish made it with the sauce from the jar because she couldn't find the other stuff. That's fine. I found necessary in the word search, she said. 1 C 2 S's. You always find it first, he said. She smiled without looking up. I told you. He heated the pasta and ate it standing at the counter and watched her finish the word search, and it was the most restorative 20 minutes of his day. December arrived, and the work didn't slow down. Protocol Framework went through its final legal review in the first week of December and came back with 7 modifications, 3 of which Caleb pushed back on and 1, 2 of which he accepted as improvements, and 2 of which he accepted because the legal risk was real. and Northstar's lawyers knew things about liability exposure that he didn't. He implemented the framework across all 4 facilities in a staggered rollout that started with Redwood Falls, partly because it was the site of the original failure. No, and partly because the floor staff there already understood what the protocol was designed to prevent in a way that made the training conversations different. He ran the Redwood Falls training himself. He stood in the same conference room where Graham's investigation had concluded and walked through the new process with the management staff and HR team. And at the end, the formal part was done. He answered questions for 40 minutes. The questions were good ones, specific and practical, the kind that come from people who are actually thinking about how to use something rather than just waiting for the meeting to end. Donna asked him near the end whether the new process would have caught what Graham did. Thought about it honestly, which he always tried to do with Donna because she deserved that. It would have slowed it down significantly, he said. The independent investigator requirement would have brought in someone with no existing relationship to Graham, which means no trust dynamic to exploit. The badge record anomaly, the remote access falsification, would have been much harder to hide under cross-department verification because the forensic check would have happened as part of the standard process rather than after the fact. He paused. Would it have caught everything? I don't know. Graham was careful, but he relied on the existing process moving fast and staying inside management's control. This process doesn't do either of those things. Donna nodded. She wrote something on her notepad. Thank you, she said, for building this. Thank you for asking the honest question, he said. The legal case against Graham moved forward through December. Caleb wasn't centrally involved in it, that was Patrick and the external attorneys, but he received updates. The updates confirmed what the investigation had already shown: 3 years of systematic theft, 4 facilities implicated in the financial transactions, and 2 outside co-conspirators who had been identified through the forensic accounting and were cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Graham had hired a lawyer and was not cooperating with anyone. Total value of the merchandise and cash Graham had moved through his operation over 3 years was assessed at just over $1.4 million. Caleb sat with that number for a while when he first read it. $1.4 million. Piece by piece, shipment by shipment, over 3 years, while Graham attended quarterly reviews and gave performance feedback and sat at the head of tables in conference rooms, explaining how things worked. The scale of it was not the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was the patience. Whatever else Graham was, he'd patient, and patience of that kind, applied to harm, was one of the more difficult things to defend against. Which was exactly why you built the structure. Somewhere in all of this, in the framework revisions, and the facility visits, and the board presentations, and the late evenings at the corner table at the Thai place, 3 blocks from the office, something was shifting between Caleb and Sabrina that neither of them was naming. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was the accumulation of small things, the way she knocked on his office doorframe before coming in, which she'd started doing around week 3 and which she hadn't done with anyone else on his floor, as far as he could tell. The way she asked about Maisie, specifically not as small talk, as genuine inquiry. Yes, he'd remembering details from previous conversations in the way you remember things about people you're actually paying attention to. Way she'd started texting him things that were not work-related, not often, but consistently a piece about logistics infrastructure policy she thought he'd find interesting. A photograph of the first substantial snow of the season, with the caption, "The parking garage is going to be a problem today." Question at 10:30 on a Thursday night that said, "Do you ever not think about work?" To which he'd replied, "Define ever." And she'd sent back a response that was just a single emoji, which struck him as notable because he'd never once seen Sabrina Lockwood use an emoji in any professional context. He thought about it in the way he thought about most things that mattered carefully and without rushing and with a clear-eyed awareness of all the reasons it was complicated. She was his employer. She was 30 years old to his 32, which was not the point but was a fact. She had more power in any given room than almost anyone he'd ever worked with, and power dynamics in personal relationships had a way of creating problems that were invisible until they weren't. He had a daughter who had already had one adult disappear from her life, and Maisie was a kid who put up a very good front and felt things deeply underneath it, and that was not a consideration he was capable of setting aside. He also knew what it felt like to be in a room with someone and feel the specific quality of attention you paid to each other. He'd felt it enough times to recognize it, and he was honest enough with himself to know that was what was happening. He didn't act on it, not in December and not in January. January brought a development he hadn't anticipated. Coffee sent the 2 NDA termination files from Minneapolis. Caleb reviewed them, and one of them was clean. One of them was not. Fraudulent, nothing like what Graham had done, but procedurally rushed in a way that, under scrutiny, showed an employee who had been terminated primarily on the word of a supervisor, with whom she'd had a documented interpersonal conflict, without adequate independent review of the underlying evidence. He brought it to Sabrina. She read it. She was quiet for a while. "What are you recommending?" she said. "Contact her. Review what happened. If the termination wasn't justified by the evidence, we correct the record and offer appropriate remediation." He paused. "And we do it before she contacts a lawyer, not after." Sabrina looked at the file. "This predates my direct oversight of Minneapolis." Caleb said, "That's not the point." "No," she said. "It isn't." She closed the file. "Do it. You run the review. Take Patrick. Take legal if you need it. Keep me informed." He nodded. "Caleb," she said as he stood to leave. "Does this happen a lot? In your review of the historical cases?" He'd been waiting for her to ask that. "Often enough that I want to do a systematic audit of terminations across all 4 facilities going back 5 years, he said. "It'll take time. Some of it will come back clean. Some of it won't." She held his gaze. "Do the audit," she said. He did the audit. It took 6 weeks, running parallel to everything else. And when it was complete, he had a report that identified 9 additional cases across the 4 facilities with varying degrees of procedural concern, ranging from documentation gaps to one case that bore a close enough resemblance to Caleb's own situation that it had to be reviewed very carefully and ultimately resulted in a settlement and a formal apology. 9 cases, not 9 Grahams, nothing close, but 9 people who had moved through a process that wasn't designed to protect them, and who had been processed by that system without adequate recourse, who had mostly just accepted it and moved on. Because what else do you do when you're one person, and the company is the company? He presented the full audit results to the board in February. It was the most significant board meeting he'd attended. He was prepared for resistance, and he got a board member named Harold, who was 70 and had been on the board since Harrison Lockwood's tenure, spent 15 minutes questioning whether the audit created legal exposure for the company by surfing historical cases. Caleb let him finish and then walked through, methodically, why the exposure from surfacing the cases proactively was significantly smaller than the exposure from having them surface through litigation later, and why the cost of addressing them now was not just financially, but institutionally the right call. Harold grumbled. 2 other board members asked specific questions that were actually about understanding rather than resisting. A 4th said nothing, but was writing steadily throughout, which Caleb took as a good sign. Sabrina, sitting at the head of the table, let him run it. She contributed twice, once to clarify a legal point, once to add context to a historical operational decision that he didn't have full visibility on and otherwise stayed quiet, which he understood was a deliberate choice and which he was grateful for, because there were things you could only assess for yourself, and having the CEO speak on your behalf during them was not the same as establishing them. The board approved the remediation plan. Harold voted against. The other 6 voted in favor. Walking out of that meeting, Caleb felt something settle in him that had been slightly unsettled since the beginning, the particular uncertain a person operating at a level they haven't fully established yet, waiting to see whether the ground holds. The ground held. In March, Sabrina asked him to lunch. Lunch, a place near the office that was not the Thai restaurant, and that was busier and louder, and felt its busyness, it's slightly more casual. She ordered a sandwich. He ordered soup. She talked about a potential acquisition Northstar was considering in the Pacific Northwest, and he listened and asked questions, and then she said, in the middle of a sentence, about supply chain logistics, "I want to tell you something that isn't about work." He waited. She looked at her plate for a moment. She was not generally a person who looked at plates. She was a person who looked at whoever she was talking to with a directness that could be slightly disconcerting until you were used to it. The plate looking was information. "I'm not good at this," she said. "At what?" She stopped, saying things out loud that I can't take back if they complicate something. "It's most things worth saying," he said. She looked up. Pause. "I'm aware of what this is. I'm aware of all the reasons it's a difficult situation. I'm not asking you to respond to anything or make anything a decision right now. She stopped again the way she sometimes stopped when she was being careful with language. "I thought it was better to name it than to keep not naming it. Because I think we've both been not naming it for a while." He looked at her across the table. She was being honest in the particular, slightly uncomfortable way of a person who did not do this easily and was doing it anyway. He recognized it because he knew what it cost, and knowing what something costs is one of the ways you understand its value. He said, "We have." She exhaled slightly. "Okay. Doesn't resolve anything," he said. "I know. It's a start." He thought about Maisie. He thought about it carefully and honestly, the way he thought about everything that touched her. He thought about the specific calculus of bringing someone new into the small, functional world that the two of them had built, what that required, what it risked. He thought about what Maisie had said the night he'd lost his job then. That's what matters, and the quiet certainty in her voice, and the way it had turned out to be true. He thought he'd intervened. He thought that the things worth having were you to decide they were worth having, usually before you had any guarantee. "I have a daughter who is the most important thing in my life," he said. "Doesn't change in any configuration of anything." Sabrina said, "I wouldn't expect it to. And I'm not moving fast." "I don't work that way." "I don't either," she said, "despite evidence to the contrary in other areas of my life." He thought about her at 2 a.m. in front of a security monitor, sleeping, letting it go, running the footage until she found what she was looking for. He thought the fact that she'd driven to the office instead of waiting and that she'd spent the night building the case before she made a move. "You're more patient than you think you are," he said, "when it matters." She looked at him for a moment. Yes, that he'd intervened. Then she picked up her sandwich and took a bite and seemed conversation had arrived where it was going to arrive for now, and that was enough. It was enough. What followed was slow. Deliberately, mutually slow the pace of two people who were both aware of the weight of what they were building and who had between them accumulated knowledge of things going wrong to take the building seriously. They had dinner again, walked the 3 blocks back to the parking garage in the cold, and this time he reached for her hand without deciding to, and she let him take it without making anything of it. Yes, he'd intervened, and they walked the rest of the way in the cold with their breath showing in the lamplight. He introduced her to Maisie on a Saturday in April, which was a thing he had thought about carefully. As a formal introduction, not Maisie. This is someone important, but as a thing that happened naturally. A morning where Sabrina came to the apartment to drop off documents he'd left at the office the night before, and Maisie was at the kitchen table eating cereal in her pajamas, working on a particularly difficult word search. Maisie looked at Sabrina with the particular attentiveness she gave everyone the first time. "You're from Dad's work," she said. "I am," Sabrina said. "I'm Sabrina." "I know," Maisie said. "He talks about you." She looked back at her word search. "You can sit down if you want." There's cereal. Sabrina sat down. She did not try too hard, which was the right call, because Maisie had a very precise sensor for people who tried too hard, and it did not produce warmth in her. She accepted the cereal. Maisie slid toward her and asked about the word search, and Maisie explained her strategy for finding words, which was to look for unusual letter combinations first, because those were rarer and narrowed the grid faster. Sabrina said that was a sound approach. Maisie said she knew. Caleb stood at the counter and watched them and kept his face very still. Over the spring it became ordinary. Not easy, it was never entirely easy, because nothing real ever was. Sabrina had walls that she'd built efficiently and maintained carefully, and didn't always know she was hiding behind until Caleb pointed it out, which he did, and she was mostly receptive to, which was one of the things about her that he found most worth trusting. He had his own version of the same problem, the particular guardedness of a man who had learned to be self-sufficient for long enough that accepting help felt like admitting vulnerability, and who had to regularly remind himself that the self-sufficiency was a tool, not an identity. They argued, not often and not explosively, but with the real friction of two people who both had opinions and were used to being right. The first genuine argument was about a hiring decision he thought was too fast, and she thought was necessary. And it was uncomfortable, and neither of them handled it perfectly. And then they talked through it the following morning and came out with something better than where either of them had started, which was the only way arguments were worth having. Maisie, being Maisie, absorbed all of it without comment, and then one evening in June set down her fork at dinner, at Sabrina, and said, "Are you going to be around for a while?" Sabrina looked at her. She glanced at Caleb briefly, not for permission, just acknowledging the weight of it. Then she looked back at Maisie. "I'd like to be," she said. "If that's okay with you." Maisie considered this with the seriousness she gave decisions that mattered. "You can be annoying sometimes," she said, "but so is Dad." "That's fair," Sabrina said. "Okay," Maisie said, and picked up her fork. Caleb looked at his plate and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. The trial of Graham Pike concluded in September 14 months after the Tuesday in October that his wreathing. He was convicted on 12 counts of theft, 2 counts of fraud, 1 count of computer fraud for the falsification of the access records, and 1 count of obstruction. The sentencing was Caleb didn't attend. He told Patrick he didn't need to, and he meant it, because there was nothing in that courtroom that was going to give him something he didn't already have. He was at Maisie's school that day, sitting in a folding chair in the gymnasium with 30 other parents, watching a 5th grade showcase of student projects. Maisie had built a model of a water filtration system out of a 2-liter bottle, gravel, sand, activated carbon that she'd ordered online with a precision that suggested she'd had the project planned for weeks before the assignment was given. When it was her turn, she stood in front of the gymnasium with her hands at her sides and explained how it worked without notes. Direct, unhurried way she explained things, while 30 parents and their various levels of attention surrounded her. When she finished, she looked right at him. He gave her a single nod. She gave him one back. He thought, sitting in that folding chair in the gymnasium, about what the last 14 months had actually been. People wanted suffering to be transformative in a clean way, to have an arc that curved upward and into something you could point to and say, worth it. He'd been that person briefly in the first weeks after Northstar, sitting at the kitchen table calculating his checking account balance and telling himself it would make sense later. What he understood now was that it wasn't transformation. It was just time and work and the specific cumulative effect of making right decisions in small moments until the small moments added up to something you could recognize as a life. Graham Pike's cruelty hadn't given him Sabrina or the new work or a better version of himself. Those things existed because he'd worked for them, one unglamorous day at a time. The worst thing that had ever happened to him had also happened to be the moment the path shifted. Not suffering was instructive, but because he had refused to let it be the final word, was the only lesson, really. And it wasn't complicated. You keep going. You do the right thing when it costs you something. You build the structure so the next person has a better chance. You fix the faucet instead of leaving it, and you show up for the people who showed up for you without keeping score. He proposed to Sabrina on a Wednesday evening in October 2 years, almost to the week, from the Tuesday that had begun everything. He did it badly. The way that people who are not performers do these things, they were in the kitchen of his apartment, which he had a key to, and she was eating leftover rice from the container standing at the counter because she'd gotten there before dinner was ready, and he'd come out of the back hallway with the ring and said, "No, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I want to ask you before I overthink it more." She put down the container. She looked at the ring and looked at him and said, "That's not a very romantic setup." He said, "I'm better at other things." A pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which felt longer. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." From down the hall, Maisie called out finally. They both looked at the hallway. Maisie appeared in her pajamas at the end of it, arms crossed, with the expression of a person who had been waiting for other people to catch up. "For weeks," she said. "You're not subtle, Dad." Sabrina covered her mouth with one hand. Her shoulders were shaking. Caleb looked at his daughter, this collected, sharp, quietly fierce person he'd been trying his best to raise, and felt something large and uncomplicated move through his chest. "Go to bed," he said. "I'm going," Maisie said, already turning. "Congratulations, I guess." They were married the following summer. Small ceremony, backyard of a house they'd bought in the spring, a house with a yard, large enough for what Maisie immediately identified as a potential garden project. And drafty windows they knew about going in, and a kitchen faucet that worked perfectly. 31 guests, Mrs. Parrish, Marcus and his wife, Patrick and his partner, Donna from HR, a handful of Sabrina's people who had survived the filtering that came from her learning slowly and imperfectly to let people stay. Maisie wore a dress she'd selected herself and served as the person who held the rings, a responsibility she executed with the gravity of someone who had been asked to do something important and intended to do it correctly. The string lights were Maisie's idea. She'd seen them in a catalog and pointed at the page and said, "These," and that had been the extent of the event planning conversation. When the ceremony was over, and the small crowd of people were scattered across the yard with plates and glasses, and the particular hum of an occasion that had gone the way it was supposed to, Caleb stood for a moment by the garden that Maisie had started in April and was already threatening to expand unreasonably. The evening was warm, and the light was good, and behind him he could hear Maisie explaining something to Mrs. Parrish with great seriousness. Sabrina came and stood beside him. She had a glass of something in one hand, and her shoes were off, which happened at approximately hour 2 of any event with Sabrina regardless of the occasion. He had learned this. He had learned a lot of things. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He looked at the garden. He thought about the faucet that used to drip and the check with $34 in it and Maisie's piggy bank on the kitchen counter. He thought about a cardboard box of belongings carried through a silent warehouse. He thought about a Tuesday in October and the man he'd been driving home from that warehouse and the way he hadn't known, sitting in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel, that the road still went somewhere. "Much," he said. She leaned against him slightly in the easy, unperformed way of someone who has decided to be exactly where they are. Behind them, Maisie said something that made Mrs. Parrish laugh. The string lights held the dark back. The evening stayed warm a little longer than it had any right to. It was enough. It was more than enough. Yes, he'd intervened. It was the life he hadn't known he was moving toward, built from the refused to stop life, by a man who refused to stop building, and by a little girl who had known all along that what mattered was simply what was true.